The noon sun bled white over the desert, turning the horizon into a shimmering veil of heat where sky and earth seemed to melt into one. A lone cowboy rode through the haze. Boots cracked, coat faded, hat tilted low against the glare. His name was Jeb Carter, a drifter with callous hands and eyes that had seen too much dust and too little kindness. The wind chased him as he rode toward a scattered wooden post that marked the edge of an Apache trading camp, a quiet place where deals were whispered and trust was rarer than rain. His horse, old and limping, had given up its spirit the night before, and Jeb had buried it under a stunted mesquite tree. Now, he came seeking a new one, or at least something that could carry him north to the silver mines of Nevada. The camp shimmered ahead, its outlines wavering in the heat. A few hides hung on wooden frames. Smoke rose from low fires, and the faint sound of drums drifted through the dry air. The Apache chief waited in the shade of a great cottonwood, his face carved by time, eyes dark as storm clouds. Jeb dismounted, wiped his brow, and nodded politely. "I heard tell you got horses to sell," he said, his voice low, respectful. The chief studied him for a long moment, then motioned toward a corral where 3 painted mustangs stood tethered. Their hides gleamed like copper in the light. Jeb's gaze fixed on a black stallion, strong, wild, and proud. It looked like freedom itself. "That one," he said, pointing. The chief's lips curved into a faint smile. $12, he said in careful English. Jeb reached into his coat, counted out the coins, his last 12, earned over 2 months of hauling freight through dust storms and gunfire, and laid them gently in the man's palm. The chief closed his hand over the money, but didn't move. He called out a few words in Apache, and from one of the nearby tents emerged 2 young women, barefoot and silent, their hair braided with feathers and beads. They stood side by side, their faces calm, their eyes unreadable. Jeb turned toward them, confusion flickering in his expression. "What's this?" he asked softly. The chief's gaze was steady. "The horse is strong," he said, "but not free. My daughters will go with him, to serve, to guide, to keep him calm. It is the old way." The words hung in the air like smoke. Jeb felt a tightness in his chest. "That ain't part of my deal," he muttered. The chief tilted his head. "It is now." Behind him, the mustang snorted and pawed the earth, the wind stirring its mane like a black flame. Jeb hesitated. His pride urged him to refuse, but something in the chief's eyes, a warning or perhaps mercy, held him still. The younger daughter met his gaze then, her eyes like cool water under desert sun. She didn't speak, but the look she gave was neither fear nor submission. It was quiet defiance. Jeb exhaled slowly and nodded. "All right," he said finally, "but I ain't no master." The chief said nothing, just placed a hand on his shoulder, heavy and final. "Then you may survive," he murmured. The deal was sealed not with paper, but with the wind itself. Jeb led the black horse in the corral, the 2 sisters walking behind him, their steps light and silent as falling leaves. The sun sank lower, painting the sand gold, and for the first time in years, Jeb felt the strange pull of destiny tugging at his spine. He didn't know yet whether he had just bought his freedom or sealed his fate. By the time the sun began to sink behind the crimson mesas, the 3 travelers and the horse had left the Apache camp far behind. The wind had quieted, and the desert stretched endless and ancient before them, painted in strokes of orange, violet, and gold. Jeb Carter rode the black stallion, the finest creature he'd ever seen, its muscles rolling under him like liquid steel, its breath steady as a drumbeat. The 2 Apache sisters walked silently on either side, moving with a grace that made no sound at all, their bare feet barely disturbing the dust. The older one carried a small bundle tied in deerskin. The younger had a knife at her hip and eyes that watched everything. The horizon, the horse, and him. Jeb couldn't decide if he'd made a fair deal or stepped into something that wasn't meant for mortal hands. The stillness pressed on him. Only the creak of his saddle and the slow rhythm of hooves broke the quiet. The horse seemed restless, tossing its head, ears twitching as though it sensed something unseen. Jeb patted its neck. "Easy now, boy," he murmured. "Ain't no ghosts out here tonight." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed himself. Night came sudden and fierce in the desert. The horizon swallowed the last of the light, and the air turned cold enough to bite. They made camp near a cluster of boulders, where the wind howled less and the stars burned low and clear. Jeb built a small fire, the orange glow flickering against their faces. The sisters sat across from him, quiet as statues. He passed them his canteen, and the older one nodded once before taking a sip. The younger still hadn't spoken a single word since they'd left the camp. She stared into the flames, her expression distant. "You got names?" Jeb asked, his voice rough in the stillness. The older one looked up. "Naeli," she said softly, touching her chest. Then she gestured to her sister. "Tea." Jeb nodded slowly. "Well, Naeli, Tea, name's Jeb Carter. Ain't much to tell about me. Just a man trying to ride where the wind don't chase him." Naeli's gaze held it for a moment. Unreadable, calm, ancient somehow. "The wind chases everyone," she said, then turned her eyes back to the fire. The night deepened. Coyotes called in the distance, their howls echoing like lost souls. Jeb lay back, staring at the stars, the black stallion standing nearby, its dark shape shimmering under the moonlight. He felt the desert watching, a silent, patient thing that kept its secrets buried in the sand. As his eyes began to close, he heard movement, soft steps near the fire. He looked up to see Tea standing over him, her hair glinting silver in the moonlight. In her hands, she held a small clay bowl filled with ashes and herbs. She knelt beside him and began to murmur something low and rhythmic, in a language he couldn't understand. "What you doing?" he asked, voice hushed. She didn't look at him, just continued to chant, her voice steady. Naeli's eyes opened across the fire, calm and knowing. "She blesses the path," she said quietly. "The horse carries power, old power. It must be bound to you, or it will turn against you." Jeb frowned, uneasy, but he didn't move. Tea sprinkled the ashes in a circle around where he lay, then pressed her hand to his chest. Her touch was cold, electric, for a heartbeat. The night seemed to hold its breath. Then the fire flared bright and sudden, before dying back to a slow burn. She rose without a word and returned to her place beside her sister. Jeb sat up slowly, his pulse hammering. He glanced at the horse, which now stood completely still, staring into the dark as if something waited out there beyond the rocks. "What kind of power you talk about?" he asked, but Naeli only said, "The kind that chooses." Her words echoed in his mind long after the flames dimmed. The desert wind began to whisper again, curling through the camp like a voice speaking from far away. Jeb turned his head toward the dark, where shadows moved that he couldn't name. Somewhere out there, something was listening, and the deal he thought he'd made for a horse now felt more like a pact he couldn't break. The next morning came thin and cold, the kind of light that turned the desert pale and quiet. Jeb Carter stirred awake to find the campfire nothing but a circle of ash and the sisters already standing by the horse. The black stallion pawed the ground restlessly, snorting clouds of steam into the morning air. Jeb sat up, brushing sand from his coat. The air felt different, charged like the breath before storm. The sky above was a wash of faded gold, and a hawk circled lazily against it, its cry long and mournful. Naeli stood still, her hand resting lightly on the horse's mane, eyes closed as though listening to something beyond sound. "He's uneasy," Jeb muttered, tightening the cinch on the saddle. She opened her eyes and said softly, "The land is uneasy, too." Tea looked up from where she was kneeling, drawing symbols in the dust with the point of her knife. "Spirits moved last night," she said in a voice so soft it almost disappeared in the wind. Jeb frowned, glancing at the horizon where waves of heat were already rising off the sand. "Spirits don't buy or sell horses," he said. "Men do." Naeli's gaze lingered on him for a moment, a faint sadness there. "Men only think they make deals. The earth remembers the real ones." They rode out by mid-morning, following a dry riverbed that wound north between red cliffs. The land changed with every mile, from flat plains to canyons carved like scars into the earth. The horse moved with eerie calm, its hooves barely stirring dust, its ears twitching as if tuned to voices only it could hear. Jeb kept glancing at the sisters, their faces unreadable beneath the morning light. He wanted to ask them what they meant, what this talk of spirits and debts really was. But each time he opened his mouth, the wind seemed to rise and hush him. Around noon, they stopped at a spring hidden between rocks, a thin trickle of clear water that shimmered in the sunlight. Taya knelt to fill a gourd, but when her reflection rippled on the surface, she froze. Jeb saw her eyes widen slightly, and she whispered something Apache, a prayer maybe or a warning. He stepped closer. "What is it?" She looked up, pale now. "The water remembers," she said. "It showed your face, and the face of another behind you." Jeb stiffened, scanning the canyon walls. But there was no one, only wind, whispering through the stones like voices that never stopped talking. They drank quickly and moved on, but the silence between them grew heavy, filled with things none of them wanted to name. By the time the sun fell low again, the air had turned strange, still but humming, as if the desert itself held its breath. Jeb noticed tracks in the sand, not human, not quite animal. The prints were deep, long, almost clawed. "Mountain lion?" he guessed. Naeli shook her head slowly. "No lion walks on two legs." The words chilled him more than the wind. They made camp early, near a cluster of boulders shaped like sleeping giants. Jeb unsaddled the horse and tied it loosely, but the animal wouldn't calm. It kept turning its head toward the darkening canyon, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring. "You see something?" Jeb whispered. The horse snorted again, pawing the ground. When the first stars appeared, Taya began to hum, a slow, haunting melody that drifted through the night like smoke. Naeli added her voice to it, soft and low, until the desert seemed to echo with them. The sound wrapped around Jeb, pulling at something deep inside him. He found himself staring into the fire, half dreaming, half awake. In the flicker of flame, he saw flashes. Men on horseback, dust storms, arrows flying, a black horse galloping through smoke. His heart pounded. He blinked, and the vision vanished, leaving only the whisper of the sister's song. He looked up at them, both still singing, faces calm and distant, eyes reflecting the firelight. Then, from far out in the darkness, something answered, a low, drawn-out wail that rose and fell with the wind. The horse reared, neighing wildly. Jeb sprang up, hand on his gun, eyes straining into the night. The wail came again, closer this time, part wind, part voice. The sister stopped singing. The desert went silent. Naeli looked at him and said, "They are coming for what was promised." The fire sputtered, the air went cold, and the darkness seemed to breathe. The night deepened like a wound spreading through the earth. The wind, once warm, had turned sharp and whispering, carrying voices that weren't born of the living. Jeb Carter stood beside the trembling stallion, one hand gripping the reins, the other near the handle of his revolver. The sisters sat by the dying fire, their faces calm but their eyes reflecting something ancient, something that knew what was coming. The air seemed to hum with a low vibration, like the growl of the earth itself. Jeb stared into black canyon mouths stretching before them, a hollow cut into the desert where no light reached. It felt alive, breathing. Taya rose slowly, her knife catching the faint gleam of the embers. "They come for blood unpaid," she said softly. Jeb's pulse quickened. "Whose blood?" he asked. Naeli looked up, her voice low and heavy. "Yours, Cowboy. Or the one you were before." The word struck him like a blow. "I ain't never wronged your people," he said. "I paid my way, fair and square." But even as he said it, something deep inside him shifted, a memory half buried under years of whiskey and dust. The fire guttered, sending shadows leaping across the rocks. From the darkness, shapes began to form, figures made of smoke and sand, tall and thin, their eyes burning faintly like embers. They moved slowly, silently, drifting closer with each gust of wind. The horse screamed, "Try and pull free." Jeb drew his gun, the sound of the hammer clicking loud in the silence. "Stay back," he shouted. The spirits didn't stop. They came as though walking through water, their faces pale masks of sorrow and rage. Taya stepped between Jeb and the gun, her hand raised. "Bullets won't kill the wind," she said. "Lower your weapon." Her voice carried such weight that he obeyed without thinking. The black stallion stomped and snorted, muscles quivering under the moonlight. Naeli began to chant in a low voice, words that seemed to twist the air itself. The shadows paused, listening. The chant grew louder, and the wind rose with it, swirling dust into a vortex around the camp. Jeb stumbled back, shielding his face as grit cut through the air. He could barely see, but in the whirling sand he caught flashes. A cabin burning, screams, men in blue coats firing rifles, a black horse breaking free into the flames. His chest ached as the memories surged. Not his life, not exactly, but a life that felt carved into his bones. "I wasn't there," he gasped, dropping to his knees. "That wasn't me." Naeli's voice cut through the storm. "The land remembers names, not faces. You carry his name." Her words echoed, and Jeb understood. The spirits weren't hunting him for what he'd done, but for what his bloodline owed. His great-grandfather, a cavalryman who'd burned Apache camps in this very desert, had ridden the same bloodline horse. The deal he thought was a trade for freedom was, in truth, a call to judgment. The storm of sand suddenly stopped. The air felt dead still. The spirits stood motionless now, surrounding them in a silent circle. Naeli and Taya stepped forward, placing their hands on Jeb's shoulders. "The horse carries your curse," Naeli whispered, "but it can carry your forgiveness, too, if you face the one who waits." Jeb lifted his eyes, following their gaze to the edge of the canyon. There, in the faint moonlight, a figure stood, tall, cloaked in shadows, wearing a tattered cavalry coat and holding a saber at his side. Jeb's throat tightened. He knew that stance. He'd seen it in the visions. The man's face was hidden by shadow, but Jeb didn't need to see it to know. It was the ghost of his own blood. The wind whispered, "Pay what was owed." The black stallion reared, eyes burning like fire, and in that instant man and spirit moved as one. The ghost charged forward, sand swirling around him like smoke. The sisters began to chant louder, the air vibrating with power. Jeb raised his arms, unable to move, caught between two worlds. When the spirit reached him, the world exploded into blinding white light. For a heartbeat, all sound vanished. No wind, no chanting, no life. Then came a voice, low and eternal. "The debt is not yet settled." When Jeb opened his eyes, he was alone. The sisters were gone, the fire dead, and the stallion stood still as stone beside him. The dawn's first light crawled over the canyon walls, painting them red like blood. His hands shook as he touched the horse's mane. The mark of the deal, 3 lines over wave, now burned faintly into his skin. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled across the horizon, though the sky was clear. The wind whispered to the rocks again, softer now, almost kind. But Jeb knew the night had only begun to speak its secrets. Morning crawled over the desert like a dying ember, turning the world into gold and bone. Jeb Carter rode the black stallion to the canyon mouth, its hooves striking sparks against the dry rock. The wind had died, leaving behind an eerie stillness, as if even the earth held its breath. His face was cut with fatigue, eyes hollow from the storm of ghosts and memory. Every ridge and shadow whispered the same name, Carter. He felt it in the horse's breath, in the trembling of the reins, in the pulse of his own heart. The sisters were gone, vanished like smoke, yet their presence clung to him. The faint scent of sage and ash, the echo of chanting woven into the air. He left the dying campfire behind and followed the path that the wind had carved for him. Toward the canyon, the spirits called a mouth of blood. The deeper he rode, the narrower the world became, the walls closing like the ribs of a great beast. Bones littered the ground, deer, cattle, men, sun-bleached, scattered, picked clean by time. He stopped at a bend where the canyon widened into a natural amphitheater. There, painted across the stone in red ochre and ash, were scenes of battle and betrayal. Soldiers burning camps, women weeping under a black sun, a horse with fire in its eyes leading the charge. Beneath the mural, a crude wooden cross stood planted in the sand, wrapped with black feathers and dried roses. Jeb dismounted, his boots crunching over gravel. He knelt beside the cross and traced his fingers over a name barely etched in the wood. Samuel Carter, 1872. His blood froze. Samuel Carter, his great-grandfather. The cavalry goes from his visions. His heart hammered like a drum as he realized the truth. This canyon wasn't just where his ancestor had died. It was where his crimes were buried. He whispered to the wind, "You sent me here to finish what he started. The horse snorted, pawing at the ground, restless. A shadow passed overhead, a vulture circling slow. As Jeb stood, the air thickened. The ground pulsed beneath his boots, a faint tremor, like a heartbeat. The sound of hooves echoed through the canyon, though the horse beside him was still. He turned sharply, gun drawn, but there was nothing there, only the whisper of the wind. Then the voice came again, low and broken, carried by the dust. "You ride my curse, boy." The words crawled into his ears, old and cold as a grave. From afar into the canyon, a figure appeared, riding through the heat shimmer. A man dressed in a faded blue cavalry coat, the same tattered coat from his visions. The ghost rode a horse of smoke and ash, its eyes like burning coals. The saber at his hip glinted once in the pale light. Samuel Carter. Jeb breathed. The ghost reined his horse to a stop, his hollow eyes fixed on Jeb. "You carry my blood," the spirit said, voice echoing to the canyon. "And my sin." Jeb's throat went dry. "I ain't no killer," he said. "Whatever you done, it ends here." The ghost tilted his head, the faintest smirk cutting through the emptiness. "It ends when the land forgives us, not before." Then, without warning, the spirit charged. The ground shook with the thunder of hooves, though no dust rose. Jeb drew and fired 1, 2, 3 shots. The bullets passed through smoke and vanished into the cliffs. The spirit's saber cut through the air, grazing Jeb's shoulder with a burn like fire and ice. He fell, rolling through the dust, his revolver clattering away. The stallion reared and screamed, its black mane whipping like storm clouds. The spirit halted inches from him, lowering the saber until it pointed at Jeb's chest. "You will ride the path I rode," he said. "You will feel the weight of every name I burned." Then the spirit leaned close, whispering something Jeb barely caught. "The chief's daughters are not what you think." Before Jeb could speak, the ghost vanished, dissolved into the wind like smoke torn apart. The canyon fell silent. He lay there, breathing hard, the wound on his shoulder glowing faintly blue. Not blood, but light. The horse stepped closer, lowering its head as if in sorrow. Jeb looked up at the painted wall, now alive with movement. The images shifted, replaying the massacre of the Apache camp, the screams echoing through his skull. He saw his ancestor, Samuel Carter, riding through flames with the same black stallion beneath him, and behind him, 2 young women fleeing into the desert, the same 2 faces he'd seen by his fire. The sisters. They weren't alive in the way he thought. They were bound to this curse, daughters of vengeance and flame. The wind picked up again, whispering to the canyon, and in its voice he heard a name carried softly, almost tenderly. Naeli? The realization struck him like a blow. The deal with the chief wasn't payment. It was redemption. The horse was a vessel, and the sisters were the keepers of a soul long damned. Somewhere deep within the canyon, a drum began to beat, slow, steady, growing louder with each thud, the same rhythm as his heart. The sun dipped lower, painting the cliffs red as blood. The air smelled of gunpowder and rain. Jeb rose slowly, his breath ragged, and whispered, "Then I'll ride your path, Samuel, but I'll end it my way." He swung onto the stallion's back, the reins hot beneath his hands, and turned toward the sound of the drums. The canyon's mouth glowed faintly ahead, not with light, but with something older, hungrier. The horse began to move, each step echoing like thunder. The drums grew louder, closer, calling him deeper into the land his blood had once destroyed. Above him, the vulture circled again, crying into the coming dusk. The desert watched in silence as Jeb Carter rode toward his reckoning. The sun slipped behind the red cliffs, and twilight fell across the canyon, like a curtain drawn by unseen hands. Jeb Carter urged the black stallion forward, following the sound of the distant drums echoing through stone and wind. Each beat pulsed through his bones, leading him deeper into the shadowed heart of the desert. The air was heavy with the smell of sage and smoke, the kind that clings to old fires and older graves. The canyon walls glowed faintly, streaked with ancient symbols that pulsed with a dull red light as he passed. The horse's breath steamed in the cooling air, though the heat of the day still shimmered faintly above the rocks. He could feel the wound on his shoulder burning, its blue glow pulsing with the rhythm of the drums, like the ghost's curse had seeped into his blood. He muttered under his breath, "Ain't no turning back now." The horse snorted in reply, its eyes catching the dying light, glimmering like embers. The canyon opened into a vast basin, a hollow carved by centuries of storms and blood. In the center stood a ring of standing stones, black and polished as glass, each one carved with spirals and faces of long-forgotten spirits. Between them flickered ghostly flames, not fire, but light that seemed to burn inside the air itself. And there, at the heart of the circle, stood the sisters. Naeli and Taya, their hair unbound, their faces painted with ash and crimson. They looked older now, ageless even, their eyes reflecting both grief and power. "You came," Naeli said softly. "The blood called you, and you answered." Jeb dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the dust. "Your father made a deal," he said. "I thought I was buying a horse." Taya's expression darkened. "You were buying freedom, but not yours. Ours." The wind stirred, making the flames dance higher. Naeli stepped forward, the earth humming beneath her bare feet. "Samuel Carter burned our mother's village. He took everything. When your kind rode away, our father bound his vengeance into the land, and into this horse. It carries the souls of the fallen, waiting for the one who would return." Jeb swallowed hard. "You mean me?" Naeli nodded. "You and the spirit bound to your name." The wind grew colder. The drums faded into silence, replaced by the low growl of thunder rolling across the sky. Lightning flashed somewhere beyond the canyon walls, a storm gathering on the horizon. The horse shifted uneasily, its mane whipping the wind, eyes glowing like coals ready to ignite. Jeb looked at the sisters, his voice rough. "So what happens now?" Taya's gaze was steady. "Now you choose. The land can forgive, but only through sacrifice." The words cut through him like a blade. He felt the ghost's presence again, circling, unseen but heavy in the air. The earth trembled, and from the edges of the stone circle, figures began to rise. The same spirits from before, their bodies made of sand and moonlight, faces twisted with sorrow. They surrounded him in silence. The sisters began to chant again, their voices weaving through the wind. The horse neighed, wild and defiant, its hooves striking sparks in the ground. The air shimmered, and Samuel Carter's ghost emerged from the light, his saber drawn, eyes empty. "The blood must balance," he said, his voice echoing like thunder. "Yours or mine?" Jeb's hand tightened around the revolver at his side, but he didn't draw. He stared at the ghost, his ancestor, his curse, and said, "No more killing, no more burning." The spirit paused, flickering, uncertain. Naeli's chanting grew louder, filling the canyon with sound like wind and water and grief. The flames turned blue. The air cracked with power. The spirits pressed closer, whispering words Jeb couldn't understand. Samuel raised a saber high, ready to strike, but Jeb stepped forward, unarmed, spreading his arms wide. "Take me if you have to," he said, "but let them rest." The moment froze in silence. The thunder ceased. The wind stilled. Then the saber dropped, not into Jeb's chest, but to the ground between them. The ghost's face softened, the fire in his eyes dimming. Slowly, Samuel Carter lowered his head. "Then let it end." His voice broke, fading into the wind. One by one, the spirits dissolved, their light scattering like sparks across the darkening canyon. The sisters' chanting slowed, then stopped. The horse bowed its head, breathing deep and heavy. And for the first time, the air felt clean, the weight lifted from the land. Jeb stood trembling, the blue glow on his shoulder fading to nothing. Naeli stepped closer, her hand brushing the wound. "The debt is paid," she whispered. Taya nodded once, her eyes glistening. "But the land remembers those who made peace." Lightning flashed again, closer now, and the rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavy, washing dust and blood and ash from the earth. The sisters turned, their figures dissolving into mist as the storm swept over them. "Wait!" Jeb called, but they were gone, leaving only their voices in the rain. "Ride free, Carter." He stood there in the downpour, the stallion beside him, both soaked and trembling. For the first time, he felt the world breathe again. The curse was broken, but something deeper had awakened. Somewhere behind the storm, another drum began to beat, not of vengeance, but of fate. He mounted the stallion once more, turning toward the open desert where lightning split the sky. The rain glistened on his coat, the earth steaming beneath the hooves. As they rode out the canyon, the ghost saber remained behind, half buried in the wet sand. The last relic of a war that had finally ended. But Jeb couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't peace. It was the beginning of something else. The horizon glowed faintly, a strange red light pulsing behind the storm. He whispered to the horse, "Let's see what waits beyond the rain." And together they rode into the storm, where thunder rolled like a promise that hadn't yet been kept. The rain had stopped by dawn, leaving the desert glistening like molten glass beneath the rising sun. Mist drifted between the rocks, curling low around the horse's legs as Jeb Carter rode slowly toward the horizon. The land that had once grown beneath the weight of its ghosts now lay silent, watching. He could hear only the rhythmic creak of the saddle and the soft exhale of the black stallion. The storm had washed the blood and ash away, but in its place came a strange, uneasy calm. Jeb's hat dripped water onto his coat, his face shadowed but tired, lined with the kind of weariness that settles deeper than bone. He thought of the sisters, of Naeli's voice fading into the rain, of Tea's steady gaze when the spirits dissolved. Their faces haunted him not with fear, but with something closer to longing. The wind brushed across his cheek, whispering their names like an old song. He touched the mark on his shoulder, now only a faint scar, and wondered if the land truly forgave or merely waited for the next debt to be paid. He followed the trail west, toward a small mining town named Redemption Creek, a place he'd once sworn never to see again. As he approached, the landscape shifted from wild canyon to open prairie. Fields of yellow grass swaying under the morning light, dotted with the black shapes of crows picking through the remains of storm-swept carcasses. The town appeared ahead, half buried in mist. A handful of wooden buildings, a crooked church steeple, and the faint sound of a piano drifting from the saloon. Jeb rode in slow, the stallion's hooves sinking into the muddy street. A few faces turned toward him, miners, drifters, women in shawls, but no one spoke. They looked at him the way one looks at a shadow that doesn't belong in daylight. He tied the horse outside the saloon and stepped through the swinging doors. Inside, the light was dim and golden, dust floating through the beams like lazy ghosts. The bartender froze mid-polish when he saw Jeb. "Didn't think I'd ever see you back in Redemption," he muttered. Jeb nodded once. "Didn't think I'd live long enough to come back." He ordered whiskey and took a seat near the window. The piano stopped. Silence filled the room like smoke. Outside, the clouds began to drift apart, revealing the full brilliance of the morning sun, and with it, something strange glinting in the mud beyond the saloon. Jeb leaned forward, squinting. It was a necklace, silver, with a turquoise stone at its center, the same one Naeli had worn the night she vanished. He pushed away from the table and walked outside, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. The air smelled of wet wood and dust. He bent to pick up the necklace, and as his fingers brushed the metal, the wind shifted, cold and sudden. He froze. A shadow stretched across the mud beside him, long, tall, not his own. Slowly he turned. Standing at the far end of the street, half hidden in mist, was a figure, a woman. Her hair was long and dark, her dress pale as bone, fluttering in the wind. It was Naeli. Jeb's breath caught in his chest. "Naeli," he whispered, but she didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on him, filled with sadness deeper than the desert itself. He stepped forward, heart pounding, but with each step he took, the space between them seemed to stretch wider, the air thickening like syrup. The sound of wind turned hollow, then vanished completely. The world fell still. Naeli lifted her hand and pointed behind him. Jeb turned slowly and froze. The townsfolk had gathered silently in the street, their faces blank, their eyes burning faintly blue. One by one, they began to whisper in the same voice that had haunted his dreams. "The land remembers." The words rose like a chant, echoing off the wooden walls, growing louder until the sound was all there was. The sky darkened again, clouds swirling above the town, lightning flashing behind them like veins of light. Jeb stumbled back, clutching the necklace. "No, it's over," he shouted. But the chant only grew stronger. The stallion neighed in terror, pulling at its reins. The ground trembled beneath his boots. Naeli's image began to fade, her face twisting with sorrow. Her voice, faint as the wind, reached him one last time. "Peace has a price. Jeb Carter, you cannot leave what the land still owns." The words struck him cold. He looked down. The mud around his boots was turning red, thickening, spreading outward like spilled blood. The air grew heavy with the scent of iron and rain. He dropped the necklace, his reflection staring back at him in the crimson water. The whispers became laughter, distant, hollow, familiar. Above the noise, another voice broke through. Deep and old, Samuel Carter's ghost, his ancestor, the one who had cursed the land. "You freed me, boy," it said, "but you freed them too." Lightning split the sky open, and the ground shook violently. The street cracked down the middle, splitting wide enough to swallow a manhole. Jeb stumbled backward as firelight glowed from the depth below. The townsfolk vanished into the mist, their voices rising into a single scream that faded into the wind. Naeli's shadow lingered one heartbeat longer, then dissolved into the light. The storm roared back to life. The black stallion tore free and galloped into the distance, disappearing beyond the horizon. Jeb stood alone in the rain again, trembling, soaked, staring at the chasm that had opened in the center of Redemption Creek. He knew now that peace was never meant for him. It wasn't over, not yet. The land was still waiting. The storm tore across Redemption Creek, like a beast unchained. Wind howled through broken shutters and torn rooftops, scattering ash and grit through the muddy streets. Jeb Carter stood at the edge of the chasm that had ripped the town in two, staring into its fiery depths. The earth below glowed like molten iron, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. The voices of the dead rose from the pit. Cries, songs, whispers, 1,000 echoes calling his name. The turquoise necklace lay at his feet, half buried in blood-colored mud, glinting in each flash of lightning. He bent to pick it up, his hand shaking. The metal burned cold against his skin. The air smelled of rain, sulfur, and sorrow. The stallion was gone, vanished into the storm. He was alone now, and he knew it. The kind of aloneness that doesn't fade when the sun comes back. He whispered into the wind, "What more do you want from me?" The wind didn't answer. Instead, it carried a single faint sound, a woman's cry, drifting up from the chasm. Naeli's voice. He peered down into the pit. Through the swirling fire and smoke, he saw shadows moving. The spirits of the Apache, the soldiers, the women and children, all bound in a whirl of flame and dust. And at the center of it, Naeli and Taya stood side by side, their forms flickering like candlelight, holding the same sorrowful calm they carried through every vision. Naeli looked up at him. Her voice was soft but steady, echoing in his mind. "You ended the curse, Jeb Carter, but you didn't heal the wound." Taya's eyes met his. "The land bleeds still. It needs what it lost, not vengeance, not fear. A life freely given." Jeb's throat tightened. "You want me to die?" The wind swirled, carrying their answer not in words, but in the aching hum of the earth itself. The storm howled louder, bending trees, tearing shingles from roofs. Flames from below rose higher, licking the rain. Jeb stumbled back, his coat whipping in the wind. He thought of all he'd lost, his home, his peace, the silence he once rode for. He thought of Samuel Carter's sins, of the fires that burned long before his time. He thought of the black stallion, born of smoke and sorrow, the living vessel of the curse. Everything he had been, every step, every deal, every gun drawn, had led him here, to this moment between sky and earth, past and forgiveness. He closed his eyes and breathed the storm in deep. "Then I'll give it," he whispered, "if it'll end this." He fastened Naeli's necklace around his wrist like a shackle, the turquoise stone glowing faintly blue, and stepped toward the edge. The ground trembled, as if the desert itself knew what he meant to do. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the faces of the spirits below, their eyes turning upward in unison. For a heartbeat, time held its breath. Jeb looked once more toward the horizon, where the stormlight met the edge of the world. "You can rest now," he murmured. Then he stepped forward into the light. The fall was endless. Fire and wind and water spun together around him, each memory flashing past. The horse's eyes, Naeli's touch, the ghost saber gleaming under moonlight, the desert night singing its terrible song. His body became weightless. His breath turned to wind. He wasn't falling anymore. He was becoming part of the storm, part of the land itself. Below him, Naeli and Taya raised their arms, and the flames softened into golden light. The screams became music. The chasm began to close, sealing with stone and rain and earth. The storm broke apart, and for the first time in decades, the desert sky cleared. By morning, Redemption Creek was silent again. The streets were dry. The air smelled of wet soil and dawn. The townsfolk woke as if from a long sleep, their eyes clear, their memories faded. The chasm was gone. Only a smooth patch of earth remained, warm to the touch, like a heartbeat beneath the soil. Outside town, a black stallion grazed by the riverbank, calm and free, its mane glimmering faintly in the sunrise. And by its side, half buried in the sand, was a turquoise necklace, still glowing with faint light. They say that on some nights, when the wind moves through the canyon, you can hear the soft rhythm of hooves echoing through the cliffs, a rider with no name, no shadow, guiding the storm across the desert. Some say it's Jeb Carter, keeping his promise to the land. Others say it's just the wind remembering. But those who've seen the black stallion beneath the moonlight know better. The curse didn't end. It simply changed hands, carried now by the wind, where it belongs, whispering peace to a land that finally sleeps.